what we call divine beings, right? They don't live in their own kind of supernatural world far away and we have to believe in them, but they are part of actor networks. Just like when you play a musical instrument, you can basically evoke a beautiful melody. In certain religious ceremonies, in rituals, you can also evoke the presence of divine beings. And magic is a kind of technology, right? Where you try to maybe make use of certain forces to get the gods to do your bidding. So that's not working together with the gods, right?
We live in a world where we are constantly forced to pick a side, where we are urged to conform to one view over another, to polarize, to divide our sympathies. Today, where public opinion is being skewed and twisted from left to right, it has never been more important to have your own opinion, your own ability to interpret reality, your own truth. And that's why I invited one of the leading voices on ontological plurality to this episode today. Ontology studies the nature of existence. Plurality is about our ability to hold a multitude of perspectives. André van der Braak is a professor in comparative philosophy, and his ability to navigate and interpret reality is, for me, unprecedented. I have not only gained answers, but some empirical footing to some of the biggest questions that all of us are walking around with. What is the nature of our existence? Is there such thing as interspecies communication? Can we create our own reality? André, welcome.
Thank you.
You call yourself a philosophical diplomat.
Yes.
How can we imagine that?
A philosophical diplomat is trying to navigate and trying to bring very different parties into contact with each other and to establish a philosophical dialogue.
We always start our podcast with a question from a previous speaker. And in this case, the speaker is not someone unfamiliar to you.
Okay.
It was Michiel van Elk. And his question was, what is your favorite method to experience altered states?
What is my favorite method to experience altered states? Well, there's many different ways you can answer that, and many different ways for me also to gain access to altered states of consciousness. And the way that I've been familiar with for the longest is the Zen meditation and the Zen meditation retreat. So to do a silent retreat for a long period of time, and then feel that the boundaries of your consciousness are kind of shifting.
And when we speak about altered states, it usually has a negative connotation. So people are either imagining immediately something related to being drunk or being on drugs and something unnatural. What I liked about some of the things that you wrote is that you don't speak about altered states as something unnatural. You neither talk of them as something natural. You talk of them as something supernatural, aka meaning something more than.
Yes, well, this whole term supernatural is very strange because we always think that supernatural, that refers to some kind of higher realm of divine beings that live in their own supernatural realm, and that are kind of, you have to believe in them or you have to not believe in them. But I like to use the word supernatural as two words. It's supernatural. So actually it's both very natural, but it's also more than the kind of natural than we are used to.
Sometimes when we speak about altered states, it's the very focus is about letting go of control or surrendering something to something else, becoming less of what we were. But when we speak about supernatural states, for me it doesn't really sound like we're surrendering something. It sounds like we're gaining something.
Well, it's maybe we're shifting something.
Yeah.
So it's almost like shifting the user interface.
Yeah.
That our day-to-day consciousness is actually a certain user interface for us to experience reality. And then in an altered state of consciousness, then we shift to a different user interface. And then we can also experience reality in a different way.
So you highlight a specific way to look at reality. Specifically, you mentioned the actor network theory. Can you tell us what this is?
Yes, this is the main theory from Bruno Latour. And
the most famous philosopher who nobody knows about?
Yes. Yes.
I'm stealing your words.
Yes. And he said, well, in the West, especially since Descartes in the 17th century, we like to divide up reality into two different kinds of reality. You have the subjective reality, which is my thoughts and my consciousness and my mind and my feelings. And then you have the objective reality out there, which is the objects and the material reality. And that's the two types of reality that you have, and they need to be strictly separated. And they're very different. Like the outside world of nature and of stuff, this is just like a machine, Descartes said. And the inside world, that's alive. Mm. That's where the soul is. Mm. But it's two strictly separated, different, opposing kind of parts, aspects of reality. And Bruno Latour said, well, that's simply wrong. Because we connect these two parts all the time. He calls this hybrid, right? And he says a much better way of looking at reality is to approach it as a network, that things are interconnected. And so we have all these objects around us, but it's all interconnected because it's because of this microphone that I can talk to you, and because it's being recorded, it can be listened to, and it's all entangled. It's interrelated. And also it's important for Bruno Latour, this is what he called an actor network, and it's because everything that's part of the network has some kind of agency.
So the microphone has an agency.
Yes.
Computer has an agency.
So we think, well, the microphone is just a dead piece of technology.
Yeah.
It doesn't have any agency. But in a certain way, the microphone also determines what happens.
Right.
So it has some kind of agency. But
it amplifies or de-amplifies your voice. It gives it a special effect. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we only notice it when it breaks down. Because then suddenly the whole network is down, right?
Then suddenly even I cannot function as an actor in this network.
Exactly.
And I can present myself because this element is really out.
So our own agency is always also dependent on the agency of the other nodes in the network, the other actors in the network. So for Descartes, there's this rational I inside, right? And Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, right? So in a sense, I'm the center of my universe, right? I'm at the center. And Bruno Latour says, no. The whole network thinks, and therefore we all are. But we are, right?
But it's
an interrelated kind of being.
I feel there was a natural, organic requirement for us to have this egocentric first I view for a while before we could step into the Latourian thinking more, as in we are a collective.
Yeah.
For the collective to shift slowly into that. So it's like the child who's maturing first has to learn, who am I? So that's how we did up till now.
That's what Latour also said. He said, well, it was very necessary in the 17th century and the 18th century, 19th century, maybe even 20th century. But now it's really outdated. Yeah. It has outlived its
time to grow up.
Time to grow up.
Yeah.
Time to shift.
Yeah. And in this complex network, he spoke about humans and non-human actors. And this is something I want us to go a little bit deeper into. So what is non-human?
Yes. So again, Descartes said, well, there's human and that has consciousness and it has a soul, and that is non-human and that's basically just dead matter, right? Like
what is it?
machines. Like Descartes said that animals had no soul. They were kind of
even that far.
Like machines.
Just that the table doesn't have a soul.
Table doesn't have a soul, obviously, for Descartes, and there's like this strict separation between the human and the non-human. And Bruno Latour says it's always hybrid. We all the time are interconnected also with non-human actors. And that can be tables, that can be chairs, that can be animals, but we relate to those actors.
But it's not a personification of the table that is doing.
No. It's not to somehow say, oh, the table is like myself. It's also a person or is also a human. That's not about it. And this is where the ontology comes in. And this is where it gets a little bit technical. So in philosophy, ontology is the study of being. What does it mean for something to exist? When does something exist and when doesn't it exist? And what kind of things exist and don't exist? And generally, in the West, in Western modernity, we say things can exist in the world of nature, and that's the natural realm, or they can exist in the world of culture, and that's everything that we make, right? And that's also subjective and the human aspect. And Bruno Latour says, well, that's very miserly to have only two modes of existence. And he said we can have many more different ways in which things can exist. So he wants to talk about existence in a much more pluralistic way, that many different kinds of things can exist. So a table exists as a kind of object, and it has a stable existence. It exists all the time. It even exists when I don't look at it. It's still there. But maybe there's other entities or beings that maybe don't exist all the time, but maybe only exist when they're being called, right? They emerge.
Interaction between.
They emerge in the interaction, and they resonate, right? It's like when you play an instrument and then there's a beautiful melody. But the melody only exists when the player and the instrument play together and come together in a very skillful way, and then there's a beautiful melody.
So then basically Latour would say that beautiful melody is an entity, or is a
It's a type of being, yes.
Non-human being, would that be?
Yes, and it's a non-human type of entity.
Yeah.
And then there's various ways in which he talks about those other types of entity. For example, the things that we usually call our emotions, right? Fear or anger or jealousy. And we usually talk about this as if this kind of arises from within, like a bubble of
overtaken by something else.
But then we also talk about it like I was overtaken by anger, and then we talk about it as if it comes from outside. Fear came over me. Or I was in the grip of anger, and I could do nothing about it. So Latour says we often talk about this as if those emotions are also entities, beings that exist in a different kind of way. So he said, well, let's talk about this as beings.
As a third party.
As a third party.
And I also liked, I heard once you use an analogy with respect to team spirit.
Yes.
I love that, because that really brings home the team spirit, not just on the work floor, but you mentioned it in the football field.
Yes. Yeah, sometimes we say when a team starts playing and they start playing really well and it all goes great, and then we said, look, the team spirit is really there.
Yeah.
But you can't point your finger at it, right? But yet we all know what it means, and we all see the difference between the team spirit is there or it's not there. So that's a different type of being.
Yeah, and it's nice that the word spirit is present there, because it kind of gives this non-human element and understanding and empirical kind of footing to it.
Exactly. Yeah. And this also for Latour, this gives us the freedom to talk about spirits in general in a new and different way, in a much more fruitful way.
But just for the viewers, we're about to get very technical, but please hang in there because I promise you at the end, all the dots are going to connect. He also talks about beings of transformation and being of religion.
Yes. So usually in the West, we says, oh yes, indigenous people, they speak about spirits. And then we think, oh, they believe in spirits. And what we actually mean by that often is, well, spirits and then are then kind of imaginary beings. And those natives, they're still primitive, underdeveloped, and they believe in spirits like we believe in Santa Claus. And they just need to mature and grow up, and they realize that, well, spirits don't exist.
Yeah.
And that's how we talked about it in the West. Bruno Latour says, but you can speak about spirits in a very different way. You can speak about it as ways of existence, type of existence that emerge when certain actor networks are in place. And there's a certain entanglements that kind of happen.
Would you say there is a spirit happening here in this interaction?
Yes.
How would you name it?
So, for example, we could say that you and I are right now having a very animated conversation, right? That our conversation, our talk is very lively and animated. So that already implies that something is emerging that you can't really point your finger at, right? But it's like a different way of existing. And Latour says, well, this is what's happening often in indigenous cultures, like when they do rituals or they do ceremonies and they invoke the spirits, and then the spirits are present. And then we Westerners think, oh, they believe in spirits. But for them, it's not that they believe in spirits, because they know very well that spirits don't exist in the same way as that this table exists. But yet, it's a way of talking about some intangible element that is present.
And these beings of transformation, in your definition in the book, are about forming us, right? And then you spoke about beings of religion that are transforming us.
Yes. So Bruno Latour says there's beings of transformation, and this is like the beings that are part of certain actor networks that make us feel emotions like anger or love or fear. And he says, well, that is actually what constitutes our sense of self, which is also a very Buddhist way of thinking, right? That the self is not a autonomous thing. There is no self, but the self is just a constructed network of different interrelated elements. And that is what the self is. It's like a relational notion of self. And so our continual interaction with those beings, that constitutes our sense of self, of identity, of who I am. So this is why those beings of transformation, they constitute, they form our sense of self. And then there's beings of religion, and those beings, like in the Bible, they are called angels, right? And in Buddhism, they're called bodhisattvas, and in the different religious traditions, they have various names for those kind of beings. They are beings that kind of break into our comfort zone, that get us out of our comfort zone and shake us up and transform us.
Okay, but we're getting now into a much more theological aspect.
Yes.
Conversation.
Well, I work at the Faculty of Religion and Theology, so that's my job to do that.
But your definition of religion, really got it. Take us through that.
Yes. So basically, I work at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam at the Faculty of Religion and Theology. And one of the things in these days is that it's so difficult to explain to people what religion actually really is. Because many people, secular people today, they think, oh, religion, that's a kind of superstition of the past, right? Those are people that believe in imaginary beings that don't exist. or they believed in an imaginary God that doesn't really exist, like a kind of Santa Claus. But actually, religion has to do with practice, has to do with rituals, has to do with doing something, with engaging in particular actor networks. And the Latin term religare has different meanings, but one of the meanings is to connect, right? So the religious longing is the longing for interrelatedness, for connection. And it's about engaging in practices, contemplative practices, to establish this kind of interrelatedness and establish this relationship. So it has nothing to do with belief.
There was a study done at the Columbia University where they found that actually it's religion that acts as an antidepressant. How important is religion to us today?
I think it's very important. There's a German sociologist called Hartmut Rosa, and he just wrote a book. It just came out, and it's a short book, and it's titled Why Democracy Needs Religion, and why in our times we need religion, because especially religious practices, because the religious traditions, they offer practices, ways of dealing and producing and constructing this type of interconnection that we've lost in our society, right? Because there's no belonging anymore. We don't belong to anything, and there's a lot of alienation, and there's a lot of fragmentation. So religion is very important, yeah, but not religious belief.
No.
Because that's a very kind of Protestant definition of religion, that it's about believing that certain beings exist or not exist. But that's not what religion is really about. It's about doing. It's about doing religion, and not about believing in something, being a believer. It's a verb.
Yeah. And for the viewers, I want to delve into some topics which are normally would be considered a little bit new agey, but they, the way that André is explaining them, it just makes absolute sense. So I really know that you will love this if you stick around. You talk about theurgy versus theology. So not talking about religion or not knowing about religion, but working with the gods. So knowing about them, but working with them.
Yes, so theurgy, it's a very old-fashioned concept. It's from the Neo-Platonism, and it's like 3rd, 4th century, so really a long time ago. And it means working with the gods, working with the divine in a ritual way. It's like you have the word liturgy, right? Which means also how in church you have the language of the prayers. And theurgy is like similar, right? It means doing God, right? Doing God.
Yeah.
Right?
Interesting.
So, and I really like this notion because it fits with Bruno Latour's notion of the actor network, that what we call divine beings, right? They don't live in their own kind of supernatural world far away and we have to believe in them, but they are part of actor networks. They are just like when you play a musical instrument, you can basically evoke a beautiful melody, you can evoke beauty. So in certain religious ceremonies, in rituals, you can also evoke the presence of divine beings. And in my book, I use this as a way to approach ayahuasca ceremonies, right? That by singing and dancing and moving in a ritual way, and also by ingesting ayahuasca, certain actor networks become possible, so that those divine beings can plug in,
participate.
to say, right? It's like you can only plug in the microphone when you have the right kind of
Maybe that's a good question. Why do we want them to plug in?
Why do we want them to plug in? Because they're basically part of reality, part of the whole web that we are part of. And traditionally, religious traditions are attempts to contact them, to communicate with those aspects of reality. And in the West, in modernity, we have lost that capacity. We can't, we don't have the plugs anymore.
David Abram, an ecologist you write about in your book as well, wrote the shaman is not just a priest, but also an ecologist. And he's one who works with the power of the ecosystem. So this is interspecies communication.
Exactly.
Like a tool, like a translator that helps us communicate in between species. With all the consumption of ayahuasca worldwide, it's according to research, about 4 million people in the world have already consumed ayahuasca, and 1 million are every year adding to these numbers. So more and more people are becoming astute or able to in this interspecies communication. Do you think that this means the evolution of our species, or do you think this is actually regressing back to how we used to be in the past? Because we used to be much more close to nature. We used to be much more connected with everything. We used to be kind of like the shamans. The shamans are representatives of how we used to be before.
Well, I think it's basically, it's a very interesting development because when I was young people, they used to want to kind of hitchhike to Nepal or the Himalayas, and they were hoping to meet their guru and then realize enlightenment, and that was the ideal.
Yeah.
And so the idea was the light comes from the east.
Yeah.
But nowadays, young people, they want to go to Peru and drink ayahuasca, meet a shaman, become more connected with nature. So sometimes I say, well, nowadays light comes from the south, right? It's no longer from the east, but from the south. And for a part, this is also kind of a romantic infatuation, right? It's also sometimes some parts of it are very superficial and very kind of idealistic. And so I think also for many people that try out kind of ayahuasca ceremonies, it's kind of like maybe a little bit like a new fashion, like a fad, right? It's like the next thing to try. But I think underneath that, there's something more serious going on.
A deeper longing.
A deeper longing.
Can I read a quote from your book?
Yes.
I joined Andrew's community out of a strong spiritual longing, a yearning for love and truth. I still pay tribute to this longing. It is a part of who I am, of who we all are. It is this longing for transcendence, for freedom, for overcoming our petty little self that Plato called eros, or love. It might be temporarily satisfied by material possessions, by beautiful objects, or by people that we fall in love with. Yet, at heart, this longing knows no boundaries and is never satisfied by any object. It is a longing for enlightenment. Beautiful. And you wrote this 20 years ago.
Yes.
I'm wondering, have you found in the meantime something that can satisfy that longing?
Well, what I started to realize more and more is that this is also actually a longing for truly being connected, or true relationship, for true relationality, that we all live in this network, in this web, this global web in which we're all interconnected, not only with people, but also with animals and plants and nature and the whole network, the whole web. And that our deepest longing is to be intimately entangled with that network and that web. So for me, that's what enlightenment is now. It means that these connections are being activated, are being actualized.
And are you able to be in that web more and more, be conscious and aware and activated in your day-to-day?
Yes, that's my daily practice now. My daily practice.
Well, this is really fascinating, and I know that you have some beautiful research up your sleeve and in your pocket, and I cannot wait to deconstruct it. Because, like, your view is so holistic, and this holistic approach really speaks to me, because I tend to say, if we're really referring to psychedelics specifically, then I say psychedelics are not a drug. They are a paradigm shift in how we approach mental wellness, mental well-being. And this holistic is the central point of the paradigm shift that we're talking about. So I really like this holistic approach that you're bringing about. And you already mentioned the network and interrelated being and entangled reality. And this is maybe a good place to talk about the framing that you highlight in your book about the ayahuasca, being as a tool and then towards liquid divinity.
Yes. So ontologically, when you talk about ayahuasca, it's like you have to ask, okay, what is it, right? What kind of being has it? And from our Western point of view, we can only see it as a drug.
Yeah.
It's like a substance, and then you drink it, and then you get high or in a different state of consciousness. So it's like alcohol. It's just like a substance, right? A drug. And that's one way of framing it. And nowadays, the second framing is becoming very popular, which is that ayahuasca is a medicine, that you can use it for healing, right? Healing from depression, healing from addiction, healing from PTSD. And so that's a different framing, right? It's a medicine, or even a sacred medicine according to the indigenous perspective. And then there's a third framing, which is that ayahuasca can be a sacrament. That's a religious framing. That it's a way to evoke the presence of divine beings. So that ceremonies which use ayahuasca are basically helping to evoke the presence of divine beings, which can then also transform us. This is a different way of talking about ayahuasca.
Absolutely. And you also helped me evolve my way of looking at psychedelics in general, because I used to subscribe to those views which are personifying a little bit ayahuasca in terms. So I used to speak of it as a consciousness, not just ayahuasca, also other psychedelic substances, as a consciousness with which you enter union or communion with, and which you enter a relationship with. So I always urged people, please approach this with the honor and with the humbleness that you would approach when you're dating a new partner, when you are just meeting someone that you want to impress, that you want to fall in love with, that you want to create a family maybe with. And I used to think that psychedelics are just helping us transcend our regular way of thinking, kind of taking the default mode network offline and allowing us to step more into the unconscious part of our brain. And there in the unconscious, there are all these archetypal images which are being brought to the surface and we're becoming familiar with, thereby becoming more of ourselves, right? So I had this view.
Yes.
And then I read your book.
Yes.
And I've been, how do you say that? Like progressed into another level of thinking, as in seeing ayahuasca not just as like something that changes in my brain and allows me to access certain realities, but also seeing it as you call it liquid divinity, as a consciousness. Would you call that a consciousness, or as an entity?
Yes.
You call it actually a boundary being, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the view that you were expressing is the view that's called psychedelic mysticism, right? It's a particular way of thinking about psychedelics which has been very popular since the 60s, since Aldous Huxley's book.
Yeah, and Jungian archetype.
And the Jungian archetypes. And it's very interesting because it's, on the one hand, it's much more open than the kind of scientific reductionism. So it's definitely a step forward, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's much more open, but it's actually still kind of psychological. It's a psychological way of approaching psychedelics and ayahuasca. It's all still happening in the brain and in the mind. And okay, it can activate the unconscious and deeper layers, but it's still psychological, it's still psychic. And what you lose sight of is the ontological aspect, that there's maybe also other beings that you can engage in relationship with.
And the reason I love the ontological view, and I'm so grateful that you brought it into my life and that you stepped into my world with your book and with this work. I know it's been a tremendous amount of work, and I really recommend everybody to read your book, is because this ontological perspective gives us hope. It gives us, like, you don't have to do it all alone and work hard by yourself. There is help, there is support. You can trust, you can surrender, you can relax a bit in your being and in your world, because if you are pure at heart and if you are doing your part, there is another interrelated or entangled being that's going to support you, right? So I like this ontological perspective. It gives me home.
Yes, so it's a perspective that talks about developing the capacity of working with the gods, working with divine beings. And to go back to the notion of theurgy, actually theurgy means that you learn to work together with the gods. This is what theurgy means.
And that's different than magic, you say.
And people always used to say, oh, well, that's magic, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not magic, because magic is a kind of technology, right? Where you try to maybe make use of certain forces to
manipulating. To get the gods bidding, right?
Yes, to get the gods to do your bidding. So that's not working together with the gods, right? It's like, because in theurgy, you work together with the gods, but they take the lead. And you are basically assisting them, right? Yeah. But it's not that you have your agenda and then you manipulate the gods to do your bidding, but it's like you let them do the work, right? That's what theurgy is about. And I find it such a nice metaphor also for ayahuasca ceremonies, because it's ridiculous to go into an ayahuasca ceremony and to think, now I have this particular agenda of what I would like to accomplish, and I'm going to enlist the ayahuasca to help me to accomplish what I want. Well, good luck with that, right? Because in the ceremony, then basically people discover, well, it's not about what I want. It's about something very different, and you need to learn to let go and actually to also learn to follow, right? And not to kind of...
So I always say you don't get what you want, you get what you need, right?
Yes.
And I'm wondering, well, if it's not about what I want, what is it then about?
So it's not about what I want, and then what is it then about? And you could say, well, maybe it's about what the earth wants. Maybe it's about what the planet wants or needs. And maybe it's about what the whole network, what the needs of the whole network are.
Yeah. So we're almost stepping in this element of Ecodelia, which I want to talk about. I can't wait. But first, it's like this communication with these other beings. For me, it's like emotional intelligence 2.0. Maybe we can call it, it's not emotional intelligence. It's more not even spiritual, not even theological intelligence. It's like ontological intelligence, right? Maybe, I don't know how to call it.
Yeah.
This is like we're learning to communicate with, until now we were busy with how do we communicate with each other? How do we relate one-on-one? How do we relate in teams? How do we relate at work? And now we're stepping into a totally different type of relational world.
Yes, it's like to develop new relational skills, right? To basically expand your bandwidth.
And these relational skills are about, would you say that they're about spiritual ascension?
Spiritual ascension. Actually, I don't like that term so much, because it almost seems that then you have to get away from this earth or get away from this world, as if you have to get to a higher place rather than
what it is.
Rather than really being rooted and grounded in this place. Because I think it's much more about fundamentally becoming entangled in a very healthy way in the whole network, in the whole web, in a very organic and natural way. And that's much more important than some kind of idea about becoming free of the earth or escaping the earth. It's really important to land on the earth. That's what...
How can we do that more?
Yeah, so we need to become much more sensitive and to really expand our bandwidth, first of all, of listening so that we can be receptive to more different types of being, and then to basically learn to develop the relational skills to work together with much more different types of agency.
So it's a kind of a progression that you're going through. So first you will enter this communion with this, for example, a psychedelic, where you are learning how it works. Then you are encountering this other network that's out there. Then you're getting to know them. And then at some point you're also learning how to communicate with it. But at the fourth level then is also to learn to work with them, not just to ask them or be in this guru type of relationship, like, please.
To be partners, to partner up with them.
Yeah. Wow, I love this. So this whole thing, progression we talked about in the beginning, which is happening here in relationships with humans, is also happening in other types of networks.
Yes. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And you spoke about the ecological perspective. And there's a word you mentioned in your book. It's called Ecodelia.
Yes. I love that word.
Yeah.
Because psychedelics means letting the psyche come to light.
Yeah.
Right?
The revealing of the psyche.
The revealing of the psyche, which for many people has this kind of psychological connotation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes,
that you really make contact with the unconscious and that you really expand your consciousness. It's a particular metaphor. And I like Ecodelia because it's much more about bringing this interrelatedness to light, that we become aware of how dependent, interdependent we are, and that basically the whole world is like almost one large body, and that we're all part of this one body. And this is something that many people, they say, aha, intellectually, yeah, it makes sense. But the thing is, how can you feel it in yourselves? How can you become convinced of this at a deep cellular
Experience?
Level? So
how?
And my feeling is that this is one of the purposes of ayahuasca religiosity or other types of ecodelic practice. That it's about not only becoming convinced on a mental level, but that with your whole being you become convinced, and also you increase the capacity to become entangled with this web. It's almost as if you increase the number of plugs on your body so that more different types of being can plug into you.
So it's an upgrade from belief. From belief to gnosis to really knowing.
Yeah, it's really knowing, but it's also really engaging. So sometimes I say it's not really about believing in spirits, it's about learning to work with them. So it doesn't matter whether you believe in spirits or not. I think also indigenous people, when you ask them, well, do you believe in spirits? They look at you and say, well, what do you mean? It's like asking somebody, do you believe in team spirit? Well, that's a ridiculous question, right? It's not something that you believe in or not.
Yes.
So it doesn't matter whether you believe in spirits or not, or whether you believe in divine beings or not, or whether you believe in God or not. It's all besides the point. It's about, do you develop the capacity to work with those energies?
Yeah, but before you develop the capacity to work with that, you have to believe that it's there, right? So, I mean, when we're...
Yes, so it's a little bit of a joke, right?
Yeah. It's the catch-22.
Yes, exactly.
And Richard Doyle, who developed the word Ecodelia, actually it came to him during a psychedelic trip. He is a linguist, and I'm looking if I can find his quote. But basically he realized during his session that he was having a kind of a feedback loop between the words that he was pronouncing or using And again, we're coming to the concept of agency and having agency even in those supernatural states. But he realized that there were feedback loops between the words he was using and the experience he was having. And even, the moment he had this revelation about Ecodelia and how we are ecologically responsible and interrelated and that we are part of the biggest biosphere, that moment for him was so impactful that he didn't step into his car for 7 years after that, and he only rode his bike everywhere.
Yes.
But Richard Dwell is a linguist. So language is important for him.
Yes.
And therefore, in a psychedelic trip, he found that there's feedback loop between language and the words he was using with this experience he was having. But do you think that language is important for all of us, that we should use it as a tool?
Well, I think language is only one of the tools, right? Because language is actually a kind of semiotics, right? Semiotics is also the study of science. And basically words and concepts, they are like signs that we use to communicate together. But semiotics and the world of science is much bigger than only language. Like a red traffic light is also a sign with a meaning, and we know what it means. So Richard Doyle, he speaks about, and I'm also very interested in that, about biosemiotics, about the sign language of the biological world. And when you go to the forest, then there's many different types of being that are basically exchanging signs and communicating. And it's not in words and concepts, but it's in a much wider sense. So this is also the kind of bandwidth that we need to develop, right? That we need to become skillful in, to also, so basically expand our sign language capabilities.
Yeah, so just making a little bit of a summary of everything that we spoke about till now for our viewers.
Yes.
And for my understanding, to see if I get it right. So we live in an interconnected reality, basically an ecodelic world. Can we say that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Which is a complex actor network of human and non-human beings. And they influence each other in mutual entanglement.
Yes.
Ayahuasca is a kind of a boundary being that is helping us to step into the supernatural states where we are able to access these interspecies language.
Well, maybe I can say a little bit more about that.
Yes.
Just briefly, that Charles Taylor, he's a philosopher that's written about our secular age and how it came about. He said, well, these days we all have a kind of self-consciousness. We experience ourselves as a bounded self, separate from the outer environment. We're kind of in our own shell, and we have these firm boundaries, right? It's and he calls this a buffered self. Buffered self. We have like a buffer.
Yeah.
And this is why we're not afraid of spirits, because we feel safe behind our buffer.
Yeah.
And we used to have what he calls a porous self, a very transparent self. And he says this is why in the Middle Ages people were afraid of demons and spirits. And he said, well, in our culture we say it's a sign of progress that we no longer have this kind of porous self where we feel that anything outside could threaten us, could harm us. And it's a kind of progress that now we have this buffered self where we know that, okay, spirits can't harm us and we're safe. And I think, because Charles Taylor says, well, this is just the way it is, and there's no way of going back to this previous porous self. But with ayahuasca religiosity or other types of psychedelic ceremonies, it's possible to temporarily return to this kind of porous self-experience where these buffers, they evaporate. But it's temporarily, and it's under very safe and controlled circumstances. So it was like in the laboratory.
The buffer is outsourced, basically.
Yes.
Something else.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is why I say that ayahuasca is a boundary being, because it manages to shift the boundaries between what is inside and what is outside. And this is why people sometimes say during ayahuasca ceremonies, I don't know anymore whether it's happening inside of me or outside. It all seems to merge and it all seems to be one network and one web. So this is very interesting because it allows us to revisit an earlier state of consciousness that's very necessary to realize this ecodelic interconnectedness.
Interesting. So actually that state of consciousness has always been there. We just evolved into a different type right now. And then we're speaking. So we have this porous being where ayahuasca is acting as a boundary being, and where we encounter beings of transformation, beings of religion. Beings of transformation is about self-identity. Beings of religion is about transforming the self-identity. Then you mentioned that what we bring into such a network or into such a therapy session called set is super important, but you also say how it looks like or how we do it is also important, which is called setting.
The context,
yeah,
and the circumstances.
It's very important. Shaman has an important role because he's like an interpreter in helping us to understand what's going on, but also to mediate between this.
Yes.
All these actors. And I'm wondering, well, what is the role of the brain in this whole story?
What is the role of the brain? Well, the brain is also kind of a mediator, right? Because the role of the brain is to translate our inputs, the sensory inputs, and then to translate it into conscious experience, right? And maybe you talked about this with Michiel or in other conversations, but in contemporary neuroscience, they really stress that the brain has this predictive model of what's going to happen.
Yes.
Which is like 70% of our experience.
Yeah.
And then the sensory input is only used to maybe sometimes adapt it a little bit. But it's basically the brain is already predicting what's going to happen. And then I think in ayahuasca ceremony is that it basically kind of rocks our predictive models, right? So the brain...
Ayahuasca rocks the models.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and this is why it's a boundary being, right? Because also the boundary between subject and object, that's part of the model of what the brain is expecting. So now suddenly the brain is also kind of left empty-handed, right? And that's like the ontological shock, that the brain is confused and doesn't know so well what's real anymore and what's not real. And that opens up the space. So I think also with the ayahuasca ceremonies, there's different neurological networks also within the brain on a physical level that allow for kind of a different type of connectivity, and that allows for a different user interface so that we can have a different conscious experience.
And then you mentioned ontological shock and all of this, like for somebody who's participating in such an experience, it's life-changing. It can be life-changing. So now it's maybe important for us to mention something about the process of integration.
Yeah.
Especially when we're speaking about mass adoption, which is what the world is trying to do right now, regulate and adopt and legalize psychedelics. Integration is even more important. But we speak about, you say science is about understanding and explaining, and philosophy is about interpreting.
Yes.
However, interpretation is sometimes looked down upon by science, right? I mean, interpretation leaves too much room for speculation, so there's no facts or there's no bias if we're doing all that type of kind of work. And I feel that when we're speaking about integration or integrative work with respect to psychedelic experiences, which is going to become critical and an important factor for, the way we are approaching this holistic new treatment method, interpretation is key.
Yes.
It's like, how do you interpret what you've seen? How do you interpret what you received as a message? What is this other non-human being trying to communicate to me? How do I place it into my day-to-day reality? So, yeah, I believe that integration is going to be key. Interpretation is an element of that. But maybe you have another method for how do you integrate a psychedelic experience? How do you deal with this ontological shock afterwards?
Well, to me, I'm a philosopher, so I would say that philosophy is very important because integration is not only a psychological matter, that you take time to process what has happened and that you give it a room to kind of sort itself out and that you maybe come to terms with your experiences. But it's also important to have some kind of ontological integration so that you don't interpret your experience only in a psychological way, but that you leave room that there's maybe more happening than only psychological. But we don't have a language for that anymore. And we are still searching, and this is what Bruno Latour is also trying to do. We're searching for new languages, new philosophies that make sense to us.
Yeah, I know that we're putting now very much the power into the hands of the psychologists in order to lead the way forward when we're talking about having psychedelics regulated and legalized. We're putting the power into the hands of the psychologists to lead the way forward for these types of therapies. And I'm wondering, are they the most equipped with the right language and the tools at the moment? And whether ontology may be the field where they need to source there are new methods for how do we help people to integrate, how do we help people?
That's very interesting because when you start to talk to psychologists about ontology, they say right away, oh, that's way above my pay grade and I don't know about ontology. I'm just kind of like an agnostic, right? I don't know what happens. I just focus on people's experiences and whether it's real or not.
The conscious mind, the unconscious mind. Yeah. Go back to the devolved version of what we discussed.
Yes. So they have like a kind of ontological allergy, right, to those kind of questions.
Yeah.
But it's important that it's also comes back into the conversation. And there's kind of like a similarity with the whole kind of mindfulness hype, right? Because in the Buddhist tradition, the mindfulness practice also takes place in an ontological context, right? It's about the Eightfold Path to Nirvana. Yeah. So it has an ontological meaning, but in the West, with the psychologists, they reduce it to purely psychological meanings. So a lot got lost. So it's a little bit similar with also threatens to happen with ayahuasca ceremonies, that if you interpret it in only a psychological way, you reduce it in a way that's it's helpful, but also unhelpful.
Yeah, it can limit, and I feel that that's a bit of a bummer, definitely. And of course, they can attempt to develop this methods for integration through psychology, but I feel that at some point truth will prevail and truth will come to the surface, meaning that the client who is participating in such a ceremony with the psychologist and then has to go through the integration process, and the psychologist is trying to explain or reduce what they have just encountered, but they just have seen that is beyond our ability to even use words for, and the psychologist will try to reduce something like that to an explainable model of the psyche.
Yes.
I think the client will say, "What? No, I know what I've seen. I know how I..."
Yes, but then the problem is that the client doesn't have a narrative, and we as a society don't have another narrative in order to talk about these things in a way that they make sense.
And that's why I love that you are here, because that's the narrative I'm trying.
That's what I'm trying to do, yes.
Beautiful. Andrew Cohen, who viewed ayahuasca as a person, and he said it has a self and it is looking to communicate with us.
Mm-hmm.
That part I really like. So it's not just us who are going and looking for something. We're being pulled into this world by these non-human beings.
Yes, exactly. It's a two-way communication. And it's not only happening inside our own mind. It's not only a mental event. We're also being addressed or being called by something that's very difficult to put into words.
What you look for is looking for you. I think it was Rumi who said that.
Yes.
So basically, if you feel the calling to step into a therapy session with psychedelics, it's actually calling you already.
Yes, that's the relational aspect of it, which is very important.
Yeah. I was raised in a Soviet Union where uniformity was the method to control the society. So everything had to be the same. We had to wear the same things, cut our hairs the same way. We had to eat the same things. Everybody had the same furniture in their living room. So for me, it's a refreshing view, the plurality perspective that you have. So I was wondering, your life, like my life is more like eating the same borscht every day.
Yes.
But your life has been more like a buffet of colorful, beautiful little dishes of different tastes and backgrounds. And I'm curious, what were the top two top events in your life, let's stick to two, that formed that pluralist type of view or thinking?
Well, I think what was very important for me, the two top events were when I was young and I discovered the Eastern wisdom traditions. I discovered Buddhism, I discovered Buddhist meditation, and I'd been raised a Christian, Catholic. And then when I was like 18, I left all of that behind. I feel there's no answers there. And I feel I have to just go to the East and I have to practice meditation, and the light comes from the East.
Yeah.
And then I also met an American guru, Andrew Cohen. He was very much inspired by also this Eastern wisdom tradition, especially from India, the Advaita Vedanta, the non-dualistic tradition. And I really gave my life to that.
Yeah,
I spent 11 years in his community in the States. So that was the first important event. And the second important event was when I was 35 and when I left the community of Andrew Cohen in a disillusioned way. And I was forced to rethink all my answers. And then I thought, maybe the light is not coming from the East. And where's the light coming from? And it was like almost like a nihilistic crisis of meaning, kind of an existential crisis, that I kind of lost my faith in the Eastern approach to meditation and enlightenment, etc. And that was for me a very important event. Of course, I had to think through everything once again.
You mentioned the 11 years with Andrew Cohen, and I noticed that in the personal development communities, people are tending to give their agency over to something other than themselves. And there's this tendency to follow a shaman, to follow a guru.
Yes.
What would you recommend to, a new person starting on their personal development journey who is looking for this support and help in another?
Well, this is a very delicate topic because in a certain way you also need to surrender and you need to let go of your own opinions and you need to let go of the idea that I know best. So you need to let go. But then the danger is that you start to idealize the other person, whether it's a guru or a shaman or some kind of teacher. And then you put that on a pedestal and then you think they have the truth. And then you have to take it all back again and take back your projection and realize that no, I'm also my own teacher.
So actually you're saying that the shaman or that aspect in itself, that process is important because we're learning, hey, this is how giving the power away looks like and this is how taking it back looks like.
Exactly. So I'm not saying stay away from gurus or stay away from shamans or stay away from teachers. Of course, they're very important. They can awaken something in you that maybe nothing else can. and that you can't awaken yourself. So it's very important. This relationship can be very empowering, liberating, but then after they've awoken something, then you have to also take back your own kind of agency. Very important.
Yeah, and this phenomenon of a guru falling off a pedestal is quite known right now. I mean, there's so many people coming out of the closets, supposedly, speaking about these experiences and how in the beginning they felt catalyzed, empowered, enabled by someone, and then eventually they are disillusioned and disappointed. And that is like a perfect analogy for the process of maturation, I feel.
Yes.
And also what I really liked reading in your book is about the aspect of enlightenment. And it's important to evidence here the point of where we say that, okay, I'm going to follow a guru or I'm going to follow a shaman because what is my intention? To become more enlightened. And actually, if we're taking Immanuel Kant's definition of enlightenment, we're actually contradicting the point of what we're trying to achieve. Because Immanuel Kant used to say that enlightenment is the courage to use your own reasoning. And he was urging us to dare to know, with big capital letters, to emerge from the self-imposed immaturity. And the way he defined immaturity is our inability to have our own understanding without the help of someone else or the guidance of another person. So in an attempt to achieve enlightenment by following a guru, if we're sticking to that, a kind of counterproductive or counter-effective to the initial intention that we're wanting. So eventually, to actually achieve that, we have to let it go. And one of the reasons I started this podcast is because I wanted to help people gain back their agency. So not give it to neither the microdoses, neither to the pill, neither to whatever alcohol or whatever substance or guru or shaman, because everything that is other, that is giving us the power for temporarily, is actually reducing our own ability to have our own agency and actually reach that enlightenment. And it took you 11 years to come to the conclusion that, enlightenment is not going to be found with Andrew Cohen.
Yes, I was a very slow student.
Maturation is a long process.
Yeah.
How did you eventually, or what was it that catalyzed your maturity? How did you eventually find the courage?
It was a very long process, and all the time I had doubts, and then it's like a small crack, right? And then the crack got bigger and bigger. And on the one hand, I thought, well, with the crack getting bigger, things are falling apart. And I thought, that's my fault. It's my ego, right? But it's also like Leonard Cohen is saying, it's the cracks where the light can get in. So at the same time, I was also feeling more and more that I had to reestablish my own authenticity, and that I also had doubts about Andrew Cohen and whether he was really as enlightened as he said.
You didn't have them straight away. It took you a while before you started to develop those doubts. At first,
This was a very slow development. Very slow, because also I didn't dare to doubt, and it took a long time, many years, and then at a certain point I felt that in this community there was no room for your individuality, there was no room to listen to your own voice. It's you had to follow the party line, which is also a little bit of the Eastern European kind of. Yes, it became a little bit like that. The party line was all important, and there was this uniformity, and you had to conform to the party line.
Yeah, when the Soviet Union fell apart, it was like blinders came off. It was ontological shock, as you say, to use your words, for me to realize, wow, what we were taught was completely bogus. I mean, I believed that Lenin was my grandfather, and that's how we were raised.
Yeah.
I wore his insignia as if it was my mom wore something so important to me, so dear to me.
Yeah.
I wore it on my chest every day. And I love the words that you used just now, dare to doubt. I never dare to doubt. It's such a natural thing for a human being to doubt, and yet, because of where we are, the context, we start to develop a fear of doubting, so we don't dare to do it. Yeah, I really like that. Well, I try to introduce this tradition where we leave a question for the next speaker, without you knowing who that speaker is.
Okay.
Is there a question that you could leave me with?
Well, my approach is very much philosophical, to try to find a new narrative about ayahuasca religiosity and ayahuasca ceremonies, a new narrative that tries to make a sense of it, a kind of ecodelic narrative. And my question would be, how could you study that empirically? So how could you translate this to scientific research?
André, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your presence, for your time during Christmas. And for our viewers, thank you for watching. Thank you for being and joining us on this journey.